They found her 3 weeks after Matthew Walker vanished with their only horse sitting in a wagon she no longer owned, counting coins that added up to $2.60. Laura Whitfield had 2 children, 160 acres of Nebraska prairie that had killed stronger men, and exactly 120 days before winter would decide whether she lived or died. Jonathan Wright, who'd survived 9 brutal Nebraska winters and helped build over 20 sod houses with proper crews and equipment, looked at her half-dug foundation and delivered the verdict everyone was thinking. "Your children will freeze in that dirt pit. I've buried families who thought desperation was enough." Laura couldn't read the eviction notice Timothy Moore had sent, couldn't write her own name on the deed that promised her land or threatened to take it away. But she could lift 40 pounds, and she'd lift it 10,000 times if that's what kept her babies breathing through January. 5 months separated August from the date that would later be carved into gravestones across the Great Plains, January 12, 1888. The day temperature would drop 60 degrees in 6 hours and kill 235 people in a single afternoon. Laura had that long to build walls thick enough to hold back a blizzard that meteorologists decades later would still call unprecedented. Her children were not among the dead. The window cost $1.12, half her remaining money for a piece of glass 8 inches square. Everything else, every brick, every beam, every chance at survival, she'd have to rip from frozen earth with hands that would never heal. Matthew had taken their savings, their horse, and 6 months of her life spent believing his promises about building a future together. What he left behind fit in a wagon bed, 2 terrified children, and a choice no mother should face: build the impossible or watch them freeze. The first Saturday of August, 1887, Laura climbed down from the wagon onto land that stretched in every direction like an ocean of grass. The stalks stood tall enough to hide a man bending under their own weight when wind blew from the west. Matthew had paid $18 6 months ago to file on this claim, then built nothing. No house, no well, no fence, just grass and more grass, and the kind of silence that made her ears ring. She'd counted their supplies obsessively during the 3-week journey after Matthew disappeared: 1 cast iron stove, too heavy to carry, but impossible to abandon; bedding for 3, her mother's kitchen tools that had crossed from Saxony in 1879, 1 shovel, 1 axe, 1 handsaw; dried corn and salt pork enough for maybe 4 weeks if she cut portions down to nothing and gave most to Brandon and Emily. Brandon stood beside her holding his sister's hand, 6 years old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's German stubbornness. He didn't ask where Papa had gone, didn't ask where they'd sleep that night. He'd learned that questions with no good answers only made the silence heavier, made the weight of what they'd lost press down harder. Emily was 4. She had Matthew's eyes and Laura's watchful silence. She observed everything and said nothing, which worried Laura more than tears would have. Crying meant a child still believed someone might respond to their pain. Silence meant they'd stopped expecting help. The wagon canvas had a 3-inch tear above the left wheel that Laura had meant to mend in June. Now it was August, and the tear was still there, and rain would come through it when storms arrived. But storms were weeks away. She had time. Time for what exactly? That was the question she couldn't answer yet. That night, after Brandon and Emily had fallen asleep on the wagon bed, Laura spread their money in the moonlight. $2.60 in coins that caught the pale light and threw it back in pieces. She'd watched Matthew count out $42, 3 weeks ago before he took their draft horse and rode east without explanation or farewell. 21 days of wondering if she'd failed him somehow, if there was something she could have done differently, some way to make herself enough. 21 days of pushing that thought down deep enough that she could still function, still make decisions, still keep moving forward. Brandon crawled up beside her small body, warm against the chill that came with prairie nightfall. "Mama, where?" "Sleep, Liebling. Morning comes early." "Where will we go if—" "We're not going anywhere. This is home now." His small hand found hers in the dark fingers wrapping around her calloused palm. The question he didn't ask hung between them in the space where his father should have been. How Laura looked at her son's face, in the moonlight seeing Matthew's sharp nose and her own square jaw, and made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "We'll build a house before winter. We'll be fine." Brandon nodded, like he believed her, his faith absolute, in the way only children possess before the world teaches them that trust is dangerous. Laura wished she believed herself, wished she had even a fraction of the certainty she was trying to project into the vast uncertainty ahead. The rider appeared mid-morning on the second day. Scott Moore was 22 years old, dressed in clothes that cost more than Laura had earned in a year working the mills back in Saxony, before the immigration, before Nebraska was even a word she knew how to pronounce. He sat his horse with the casual confidence of someone who'd never wondered where his next meal would come from, never felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down until breathing itself felt difficult. Laura straightened from where she'd been testing the soil density, trying to understand what she was really dealing with. Brandon and Emily stayed behind her, silent and watchful. "Mrs. Whitfield." The way he pronounced it was wrong, turning the German W into an English one, flattening the sounds her mother had taught her. "I'm Scott Moore. My father owns Moore's General Store in town." He dismounted with theatrical slowness, making a show of it. "He sent me with this." The paper he handed her was covered in writing Laura couldn't read. English letters that might as well have been Chinese characters for all the sense they made to her eyes. But she recognized Matthew's mark at the bottom, that X she'd taught him to make when they'd filed the immigration papers, the same X she used when people asked for her signature, the mark of people who'd never learned to translate thought into written word. "What does it say?" Scott's smile was all teeth and no warmth, the expression of a predator showing its fangs before the kill. "Your husband borrowed $50 from my father last April for farm equipment and livestock." He made quotation marks with his fingers, the gesture somehow making the words feel like a lie even as he spoke them. "Equipment that never arrived, livestock that never existed. The debt remains." $50. Laura felt her stomach drop, felt the world tilt sideways as the numbers crashed into her like physical blows. She had $2.60. The contract states that if the borrower defaults, the lender can claim the collateral. In this case, the homestead claim itself. You have until spring to pay the full amount, plus interest. Scott walked a slow circle around the test pits she dug, examining her pathetic attempt at planning with the amused contempt of someone watching a child try to lift something far beyond their strength. "That's $55 now, $58 by Christmas, $62 by spring." "How much time?" Laura's voice came out steady, despite the panic clawing at her throat, trying to choke off her air. "My father's a patient man." Scott swung back onto his horse in one smooth motion, young muscles making it look effortless. He understands you're in a difficult situation. He's willing to forgive the entire debt if you sign the claim over to him voluntarily. It would save you the embarrassment of foreclosure, save your children the trauma of watching their mother fail. And if I don't, then we wait until spring, when you've frozen or given up, whichever comes first. Either way, this land belongs to Moore and Sons by April. He touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. It's nothing personal, Mrs. Whitfield, just business. The frontier has rules, and one of them is that the strong survive while the weak don't. He rode away, leaving dust and fear in equal measure, leaving Laura holding a paper she couldn't read that somehow held the power to take away the only thing standing between her children and destitution. Brandon tugged her sleeve, voice small. What did it say, Mama? That we owe money we don't have. How much? All of it. More than all of it. That night, Laura burned their beans because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The debt sat in her mind like a tumor, growing larger every time she tried to think around it. $58 by Christmas, $62 by spring. $2.60 in her pocket. A deficit so large it was almost funny, the kind of mathematical impossibility that made you want to laugh, because the alternative was screaming. Almost funny, almost. Jonathan Wright arrived on the third day, riding a gray gelding that had seen better years, but still had strength in its shoulders. 54 years old, with a white beard gone yellow at the edges from pipe smoke hands that looked carved from oak roots, knotted and scarred from decades of work that didn't allow for softness. He'd homesteaded in Custer County since 1878, 9 Nebraska winters. He'd helped build over 20 sod houses, always with crews of 3 or 4 men, always with horses and breaking plows to cut proper strips from the dense prairie earth. He rode up in late afternoon and studied the claim with an experienced eye, the wagon, the 2 children playing in grass that towered over their heads, the woman standing alone beside a stove that had no walls around it, no shelter from wind or weather or the killing cold that would arrive in 4 months. "You are the wife," he said in German, the language of her childhood, cutting through the weeks of struggling with broken English. "I am the wife," Laura answered in the same language, and the relief of hearing her mother tongue after 3 weeks of linguistic isolation nearly made her cry. Jonathan dismounted slowly, favoring his left knee in the way of men whose bodies remembered every hard winter they'd survived. He walked the perimeter of where a house might go, testing sod with his boot, gauging grass density and drainage patterns, with the expertise of someone who'd seen this process succeed and fail enough times to know the difference. Then he came back and told her what she was facing, delivered the mathematics of impossibility with the clinical precision of a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. A sod house requires cutting an acre of prairie into bricks. Each brick weighs 50 pounds, when dry 70 when wet. The walls must be 2 feet thick, any thinner, and the cold bleeds through, steals heat faster than any stove can replace it. 7 feet tall from foundation to roof beam. That's 300 bricks, maybe 350, all cut and hauled and stacked. He paused to let the numbers sink in, to let her understand the scale of what she was attempting. The ridge pole alone weighs 200 pounds and requires 3 strong men to lift into place. A crew with horses and a breaking plow can build a sod house in 1 week. A woman alone. He shook his head, the gesture carrying the weight of all the failures he'd witnessed. It cannot be done. How much would a crew cost? $25, plus materials for the roof, another 10 for tar paper and timber if you can get it cheap from Iowa. Laura felt the trap close around her with the finality of a steel jaw snapping shut. Timothy Moore wanted the land and had the debt to take it. Jonathan Wright thought she'd fail and was offering to buy before winter proved him right. The prairie itself was indifferent to her struggle, would kill her just as efficiently, whether she fought or surrendered. And she had $2.60. You have family back east. Jonathan's voice was gentler now, the tone shifting from professional assessment to something approaching kindness. I have Brandon and Emily. No one else. No one else. Jonathan looked at the children. Brandon was watching him with the wariness of a stray dog that's been kicked too many times, blue eyes old beyond their years. Emily had found a grasshopper and was tracking it through the grass with the single-minded focus of a child young enough to still find wonder in small things, oblivious to the conversation determining her fate. Mrs. Whitfield, I will be honest, because someone must be. His voice dropped lower, became almost intimate. You cannot build a house alone. Not a frame house that requires lumber you cannot afford. Not a sod house that requires strength and equipment you do not have. Not any kind of shelter that will protect those children when winter comes and the temperature drops to 40 below and the wind blows for 3 days straight without stopping. He pulled a small leather purse from his vest, the coins inside making a sound like distant bells. I can offer you $20 for the claim. It's less than it's worth, but it's more than you'll get from Timothy Moore when he forecloses. $20 will get you back to Pennsylvania or Ohio or wherever your people are. Get you there before snow flies, before you're trapped here for the winter. Laura looked at the coins in his weathered palm, counted them without touching. $20. Enough to run, enough to survive somewhere else in some town where her failure wouldn't be carved into the landscape for everyone to see. Enough to admit defeat before winter proved it for her, before her children paid the price for her stubborn refusal to accept reality. I need to think, she said, knowing it was a lie, knowing she'd already made her decision the moment Matthew rode away and left her with no choices except impossible ones. Don't think too long. September ends, the weather turns. October, you're racing the calendar. November, you're dead. He tucked the purse back into his vest. I am not trying to cheat you, Mrs. Whitfield. I am trying to save your life, and theirs. He nodded toward Brandon and Emily. A woman alone cannot cut 300 bricks of sod, haul them to a building site with no horse and no wagon, stack them into walls 7 feet high, and lift a 200-pound ridge beam into place before the first hard freeze. It is not possible. Pride will not keep you warm. Determination will not feed your children. When winter comes, it will kill you anyway, and it won't care how hard you tried. He mounted his horse with the careful movements of old joints protesting. I've seen it before. Families who thought they could beat the prairie with nothing but will. The prairie doesn't care about will. It takes everyone who isn't prepared, and half the people who are. Don't let pride bury those children beside you. He rode away, believing he'd made his case, believing she'd see reason once the shock wore off, and the reality of her situation became undeniable. Laura stood watching him disappear into grass that swallowed horses, whole swallowed men, whole swallowed entire families who came west with dreams and left nothing behind but unmarked graves and abandoned claims. Brandon came and stood beside her, his presence solid and real in a world that felt increasingly unmoored from logic or fairness. "Are we leaving Mama?" Laura looked at the empty land stretching in every direction, at the wagon that wasn't even theirs, just something Matthew had borrowed and abandoned when he couldn't ride a wagon and a horse east at the same time. At her son, who was 6 years old and already understood that the world didn't give people like them second chances, didn't care about fairness or justice, or whether children had done anything to deserve the circumstances they'd been born into. "No, we're staying." "How?" "I don't know yet, but we're staying." The words felt like a vow, like something binding that she was speaking into existence through sheer force of will. Laura spent the next 3 days taking inventory, not just of supplies, but of possibilities. She counted food 4 weeks if she rationed carefully, 3 if she didn't, 2 if she kept giving Brandon and Emily full portions while cutting her own down to almost nothing. She counted miles to town, 8 each way, a 16-mile round trip on foot, with 2 small children who couldn't walk that far. Impossible. 12 miles if she left them alone in the wagon. Also, impossible for different reasons. She counted weeks until frost, 12, maybe 14 if autumn was kind, maybe 10 if it wasn't. The prairie had a way of accelerating seasons of compressing fall into a brief golden moment before winter arrived with the sudden violence of a door slamming shut. Money, $2.60. Debt, $55 growing to $58 by December. Net worth, negative $52.40. The numbers were brutal in their honesty, unforgiving in their mathematical certainty. But numbers could be broken down, rearranged, made to fit different shapes if you were willing to think sideways, to question assumptions about what was necessary versus what was traditional. On the 3rd day, Laura walked the claim with Brandon and Emily flanking her like small guards. She knelt every 20 yards to test the sod, not just looking, but feeling, pressing her fingers into earth and gauging root density, understanding what she was really dealing with. The grass roots were dense, woven so tight that when she pulled up a chunk of sod, it came away in a single piece. Earth held together by roots that gripped earth, that gripped more roots in a matrix so strong it took real effort to tear apart. She sat back on her heels, holding Nebraska earth in her hands, and remembered something from before. Her father, before they'd left Saxony, before the immigration and the long journey across an ocean that seemed determined to kill them. He'd built a root cellar by cutting blocks of earth and stacking them like stones. That cellar had lasted 22 years, walls never shifting, never crumbling. Earth had held itself together through 24 winters of freezing and thawing, proving that the right material used the right way could endure. Laura looked at the sod brick in her hands, maybe 12 inches by 18 inches, 4 inches thick. She hefted it, testing the weight. 40 pounds, maybe 45. Heavy, but not impossible. She could lift 45 pounds. She'd lifted flour sacks in the mill back in Saxony, 100-pound bags, hoisted onto carts day after day until her back learned to protest, but her arms knew how to manage the weight. She'd lifted Emily when the child was tired, carried her for miles when small legs gave out. She'd lifted buckets of water from wells that were deeper than they had any right to be, arms burning, but refusing to quit. The question wasn't, could she lift it? The question was, could she lift it enough times? Could she cut 300 bricks, haul them, stack them into walls that would hold against wind and snow and cold that could kill in minutes? That night, while Brandon and Emily slept, Laura drew in the dirt with a stick, sketching possibilities in the moonlight. Standard sod house, 14 feet by 16 feet. Walls 2 feet thick, 7 feet tall. She did the rough mathematics Jonathan Wright had given her. 300 to 350 bricks. Even at 40 pounds each, that was 12,000 to 14,000 pounds of sod to cut, haul, and stack. Impossible for one person working alone with no equipment, no help, and a deadline measured in weeks instead of months. But what if the house was smaller? She erased and redrew 10 feet by 12 feet. Barely larger than the wagon bed, but 2 feet thick walls, because she understood instinctively that thickness mattered, that heat moved through materials, and thick materials slowed that movement. That was all she knew, but it was enough. Then the second innovation arrived like a gift. What if she dug down first, 2 feet below surface level, creating a pit? Then the walls only needed to rise 5 feet above that instead of 7. 5 feet was chin height on her. 7 feet required scaffolding. She didn't have strength she couldn't muster. She counted on her fingers in the moonlight. 10 by 12 walls, 2 feet thick, 5 feet tall, above a 2-foot pit, maybe 180 bricks. Still impossible, but the kind of impossible that felt different, less impossible. Almost maybe possible if she was willing to destroy her body in the attempt. The third innovation came from desperation rather than inspiration. The ridgepole problem, Jonathan had said, it took 3 strong men to lift a 200-pound beam. Laura didn't have 3 strong men, didn't have 1 strong man, had only herself and 2 children, and the growing certainty that traditional methods wouldn't work. But what if there was no single beam? She thought about the willow trees she'd seen growing along the creek 3/4 of a mile away. Individual willow poles were thin, flexible, maybe 15 pounds each, useless alone. But 3 poles lashed together, 4. That was a bundle she could lift, and a bundle, if lashed properly, would distribute weight the same way a solid beam did, the physics of load distribution, working whether the beam was solid oak or bundled willow. The plan scratched itself into Nebraska dirt over 3 nights of revision. Smaller house dug foundation, bundled ridge poles. Still impossible, but possible enough to try. Possible enough to bet her children's lives on. Kathleen Allen arrived on day 5 with fresh bread wrapped in cloth and 6 eggs nestled in straw. 38 years old, mother of 4 children who'd survived infancy on the Nebraska prairie, which meant she knew things about survival that couldn't be taught, only learned through the brutal process of succeeding when others failed. Trading, she said, when she handed Laura the basket, the word carrying the weight of frontier protocol. For mending work, you might do this winter. It wasn't trading. Both women knew it. But frontier charity required the fiction of exchange, the pretense that help given was help earned, that accepting kindness didn't mean accepting weakness. Laura took the baskets and the fiction both. I'll do the mending. Kathleen walked the claim while Laura explained her plan, speaking German mixed with broken English, hands moving to illustrate what words couldn't convey. The dimensions, the dug foundation, the willow pole ridge beams, the grass-packed insulation, the south-facing window to catch winter sun. When Laura finished, Kathleen was quiet for a long moment, blue eyes studying the half-dug foundation pit with an intensity that made Laura nervous. It's half the size of any house in the county, Kathleen said finally. "It only needs to keep 3 people alive. You'll need 100 trips hauling sod from cutting site to building site. No wagon, no sledge, just canvas and rope and your back." "I know. And if you get sick," Kathleen's voice was gentle but relentless. "If one of the children gets sick," Laura had thought about this, had lain awake thinking about it, running through scenarios where her body failed before the house was finished, where Emily's persistent cough turned into pneumonia, where Brandon's ankle twisted wrong and he couldn't help haul water or watch his sister. "Then I work sick," or "they work sick," or "we all die. But at least we die trying instead of running." Kathleen studied her for a long moment, seeing something that made her recalculate her initial assessment. "I can lend you a better spade. That broken thing you've been using will fail before you've cut 50 bricks. I'll take it. I can't lend you our horses. Mark needs them for harvest." "I understand." Kathleen reached into her basket and produced a small jar, the glass catching sunlight. "Lard, for your hands. The blisters will crack and bleed and get infected if you don't treat them. I've seen women lose fingers to infection that started with blisters they ignored." That evening, Kathleen told her husband Mark about the woman on the Whitfield claim. "She'll give up by October," Mark said, the certainty in his voice absolute. "No one can build alone. It's not possible." But Kathleen wasn't certain. She'd seen something in Laura's eyes, something that wasn't confidence or optimism or any of the soft emotions that crumbled under pressure. Something harder, the look of someone who'd already accepted that death was possible and decided to work anyway, who'd moved past hope into the territory of pure, stubborn refusal. "That woman will either prove everyone wrong," Kathleen said, "or she'll prove us right. Either way, we'll know by spring." But privately, she was starting to suspect which outcome was more likely, and it wasn't the one her husband predicted with such easy certainty. 3 weeks into Laura's lonely struggle, a woman appeared, walking from the southwest, emerging from the grass, like something conjured by desperation. Angela Thompson was 32 years old, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body hurt everywhere, but who'd learned to ignore pain as irrelevant to the task of continuing to exist. Her husband Robert had died 8 weeks ago, cholera that swept through their claim, and took him in 36 hours of violent agony. The bank had foreclosed when she couldn't make payments alone, when it became clear that a woman without a man was a woman without value in the eyes of institutions that counted worth in masculine terms. She'd walked 23 miles with nothing but the dress on her back and shoes that were more whole than leather feet bleeding inside them, but still moving forward, because stopping meant dying. "I can work," Angela said when she reached Laura's wagon, voice hoarse from thirst and desperation. "Cook, mend, haul, whatever you need. I just need somewhere to sleep until I can figure out what's next." Laura looked at her, saw her own desperation from 3 weeks ago reflected back like a mirror showing possible futures. Saw a woman who'd lost everything and was still standing still, asking for a chance instead of surrendering. They had food for 4 weeks. Adding Angela made it 3 weeks, maybe less. The mathematics of survival tilted further toward impossible. But Laura remembered standing alone on this claim, counting $2.60 and wondering how she'd survive. Remembered the wagon Matthew had abandoned the children he'd left behind. Remembered what it felt like to be alone in a place that rewarded solidarity and punished isolation. "You can stay," Laura said. "When the house is built, You sleep in it through winter. After that, we're even." Angela's face crumpled. She'd expected rejection, had braced herself for it, prepared herself to keep walking until she found someone willing to help, or until her body quit. This kindness, unexpected, unearned, and broke through whatever walls she'd built to keep functioning. "I'll earn my place," Angela managed through tears that came from someplace deeper than gratitude. "Can you lift 40 pounds? I can lift whatever needs lifting." What Laura didn't know, Angela's father had been a shipwright in Boston. She'd grown up watching him build vessels that needed to hold together under stress, that would tear apart lesser construction, understanding load distribution and structural integrity, and how materials behaved under pressure that tested everything to breaking point. She looked at Laura's half-dug foundation and saw immediately that the drainage was wrong. Water would pool on the northeast corner during heavy rain, undermining the foundation and rotting the lower courses. She didn't say anything that first day, just watched learned Laura's rhythm, understood what was being attempted. On the second day, she casually started regrading the foundation floor, creating a slight slope toward the door that Laura would have missed, making it look like she was just helping, not correcting, giving Laura the dignity of believing she'd done it right, while quietly ensuring success was possible. On the third day, when Laura mentioned her willow pole ridge beam plan, Angela said quietly, "We should lash them in alternating spirals. Left twist and right twist opposes the rotational force. My father used that technique on ship masts." Laura stared at her, understanding dawning. "You know construction." "I know how to keep things from falling apart when they're under stress," Angela said, "which is basically what we're doing here." That night, Laura and Angela sat by the wagon working out the final plan, drawing in dirt, while Brandon and Emily slept, two women who'd lost everything building something new from the wreckage. "If we double-stack the sod bricks at the base for the first two courses," Angela sketched as she spoke, "we create a wider foundation that distributes weight better, less settling when the roof load comes down. That's more bricks, 20 more maybe. 20 more bricks now means walls that don't crack later, 2 days of extra cutting versus losing everything when the walls fail." Laura thought about it, running the numbers. 20 more bricks, maybe 2 more days of work she couldn't afford. But walls that wouldn't crack under roof weight, wouldn't settle unevenly, and create gaps for cold to pour through. "We do it your way," Laura said. Angela smiled, for the first time since arriving. "Our way. You're building this house. I'm just making sure it doesn't fall down." Week 1 of construction nearly destroyed Laura's body in ways she hadn't imagined possible. She woke before dawn and worked until dark, stole her ability to see, until her hands couldn't grip the spade anymore, until her legs folded under her when she tried to stand. The rhythm became automatic, burned into muscle memory, cut, haul, stack, rest for 30 seconds, cut again. The cutting was brutal. She used Kathleen's spade, better than her broken one, but still inadequate, to slice vertical lines into prairie 12 inches apart. Then horizontal cuts every 18 inches. Each brick required a dozen cuts, minimum more, if roots were especially dense and tangled. Then the prying motion to break it free from earth, leveraging the spade handle and using her full body weight because arms alone weren't enough. She loaded bricks onto the canvas tarp, 3 at a time at first, 4 when she pushed herself, when the fear of winter arriving before the house was finished drove her past exhaustion into something approaching mania. 5 once, and she collapsed halfway to the building site, her legs giving out under the weight, face down in dirt, while her children watched in silent terror. Angela helped haul when she wasn't watching Brandon and Emily, or cooking, or keeping the wagon organized. Together they could move 6 bricks per trip, could make the work slightly less impossible. The body's rebellion came in stages that Laura catalogued with the detachment of someone observing their own destruction. Day 2, blisters formed on her palms, angry red bubbles, filled with fluid, centered exactly where the spade handle pressed hardest against already damaged skin. Day 4, the blisters burst, leaving raw skin underneath that wept clear fluid, mixing with dirt and sweat, turning her palms into infected messes that hurt to look at and screamed pain when she gripped the spade. Kathleen's lard helped, but not enough. Nothing would have been enough except stopping, and stopping meant dying. Day 7 calluses began forming thick ridges of hardened skin that cracked in the dry August air. The cracks bled. Laura wrapped her sure hands in cloth strips at night, unwrapped them each morning to find the cloth stuck to wounds, tearing open fresh damage when she peeled it away. Her back developed a grinding pain that settled between her shoulder blades and wouldn't leave a constant companion that shifted from sharp when she lifted to dull when she rested, but never disappeared entirely. Some mornings she couldn't stand upright until she'd walked in circles for 10 minutes, forcing her body to remember how to move coaxing joints that had seized during the night back into something approaching function. She gave larger food portions to Brandon, and Emily told herself she wasn't hungry even as her stomach cramped and her body started consuming itself for fuel. By week 3, her dress hung loose. By week 4, her cheekbones were visible in ways they hadn't been in Saxony, her face taking on the gaunt look of someone who'd decided that food was negotiable, but forward motion wasn't. The foundation pit was complete, 2 feet deep, 10 by 12 walls of the pit shored up with the first course of sod, using Angela's double-stack technique. Now they were building upward brick by brick, course by course, walls, rising inch by inch toward something that might become a house, or might become a monument to failed ambition, and only winter would decide which. Brandon tried to help in ways that broke Laura's heart. He carried brush from the creek, armloads of willow branches for the roof underlayer that they'd need months from now if they survived that long. He held stakes while Laura measured. He watched Emily when both women needed their hands free. 6 years old and working like someone who understood that his labor might be the difference between living and dying. One evening, Laura looked up and saw Emily dragging a chunk of sod toward the building site, a brick too heavy for her small body, leaving a furrow in dirt like the track of something wounded. Laura took the brick from her hands and held her daughter for a long moment without speaking, without trusting her voice to work properly. Week 4. Laura walked 8 miles to town to buy window glass. The journey taking half a day she couldn't afford to lose, but needing the window more than she needed the time. Moore's General Store occupied the corner where 2 dirt streets pretended to be a town. Timothy Moore was 45 with soft hands and calculating eyes that measured everything in terms of profit and loss. He'd made his money lending to homesteaders, then foreclosing when they couldn't pay, accumulating land through other people's failures until he owned more of Custer County than any single farmer. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said when she entered, the surprise in his voice. making it clear he'd expected her to be gone by now. "I didn't expect to see you still in the county." Laura selected a window pane 8 inches by 12 inches. The tag said $1.12 in careful handwriting. "I heard you're attempting to build something out there." Timothy leaned on his counter, studying her with the amused contempt of someone watching an ant try to move a boulder. 10 by 12, they say. That's barely a shed, barely a chicken coop." Laura brought the glass to the counter, counted out $1.12 in coins, leaving her with $1.48. Everything she had left in the world fit in her palm. "A structure that size won't hold heat," Timothy continued, warming to his theme. "Won't protect anyone when January comes and the temperature drops to 40 below, and the wind blows so hard you can't see your hand in front of your face. You know what January is like in Nebraska, Mrs. Whitfield. Or did your husband forget to mention that before he abandoned you?" She waited for her glass, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. "I've seen men freeze to death 20 feet from their own doors, seen children lose fingers and toes because their fathers couldn't keep the stove burning hot enough, seen women go mad from the isolation and the cold and the endless wind that never stops, just keeps blowing until you forget what silence sounds like." He wrapped her glass slowly, making her wait, making sure she understood he controlled this transaction. "I could still take that debt off your hands. $25 cash for the claim. You'd have enough to get back east. Start over somewhere the land doesn't try to kill you every winter." Laura took the wrapped glass. She didn't thank him, didn't acknowledge his offer, just walked out and began the 8-mile walk back, carrying $1.12 worth of light for a house everyone said would fail. Timothy watched her go and allowed himself a small smile. She'd be back by November, begging to sign over the claim for whatever he offered. They always came back. Pride only lasted until cold became real, until the mathematics of survival overwhelmed stubborn refusal to accept reality. Week 5. A man appeared carrying metal working tools. Stephen Taylor was 40 years old, the town's blacksmith, hands scarred from years of working with metal that fought back. He'd heard about the widow trying to build alone. "Brought you something," he said, pulling a metal piece from his pack. "Chimney collar, pre-fitted for a stovepipe. You'll need it when you set the stove." Laura unwrapped it. Quality metalwork, probably worth $2 she didn't have. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." Stephen examined her partially built walls with professional interest. "My wife died 3 years ago. Pneumonia. Happened in 2 days, healthy to dead so fast I didn't have time to understand what was being taken from me." He set down the collar metal ringing against metal when it touched the stove. "People helped me after, brought food, watched my shop when I couldn't function, when getting out of bed felt impossible. I never paid them back either. That's not how it works out here." He showed her how to install the collar, how to seal it properly, so smoke wouldn't leak into the house and kill them slower than freezing would. "You're building something unusual here," Stephen said, running his hand along the sod walls. "But unusual doesn't mean wrong. Sometimes the different approach is the one that works when traditional methods fail." After he left, Angela said what Laura was thinking. This country is full of people who'll write you off and people who'll help you anyway. The trick is figuring out which is which before you need them. Laura looked at the chimney collar's solid metal given freely, looked at the walls rising slowly from earth, each course representing hours of labor that destroyed her body a little more, looked at her children playing in the grass, oblivious to how close they were to the edge, how thin the margin between survival and disaster. "I think we just figured out one of the good ones," she said, and meant it. By mid-September, the walls stood 3 feet tall, 12 courses of sod brick, stacked solid enough that Laura could press her full weight against them without feeling any give. She stood in the pit and looked over the walls. Now could see the prairie stretching away in every direction, grass beginning to turn gold as summer died. The work had cost her 20 pounds she couldn't afford to lose, had turned her hands into permanent scar tissue. But the walls were rising. A woman appeared on horseback in the 3rd week of September, riding slowly like someone carrying fragile cargo. Deborah White was 27 years old, 6 months pregnant, with a belly visible even under her loose dress. She dismounted carefully, one hand supporting her back. "I heard about what you're doing." Deborah's voice carried the flat accent of someone born on the prairie, raised in a place that taught you early how to measure words carefully. Laura straightened from where she'd been mixing chinking mud, wiping her ruined hands on her apron. "What am I doing? Building hope when everyone says hope is foolish." Deborah touched the sod walls, fingers tracing the dense root structure visible between courses. "My husband, George, thinks you're insane. Says a woman can't build a house that'll stand through winter. What do you think?" Deborah was quiet for a moment, her hand still on the wall, like she was feeling for something beneath the surface. "I think if you succeed, other women will know it's possible, and that terrifies men like George who use impossible as an excuse for why they never try anything that scares them." Angela emerged from the wagon, with Brandon and Emily wiping flour from her hands. She studied Deborah with the sharp assessment of someone who'd learned to read danger in small details. "I want to learn," Deborah said, the words coming faster now, like she'd been holding them back and couldn't anymore. "How you're doing this, because—" She looked at her pregnant belly, and Laura understood without more explanation. Deborah's marriage wasn't good. The baby coming would make leaving harder, maybe impossible. But if she knew she could build shelter with her own hands, knew she could survive alone if she had to, that knowledge was power in a world that kept telling women they were helpless. "Angela and I work every morning until noon when the heat gets bad," Laura said. "You're welcome to join us." For the next 3 weeks, Deborah came 3 times a week. She couldn't lift heavy bricks because of the pregnancy, couldn't risk the strain. But she learned techniques with the intensity of someone storing away information against future need. How to judge sod density by feel, how to cut bricks that would stack properly without gaps, how to mix chinking mud to the right consistency, how to test wall level using water in a shallow pan and watching which way it tilted. One afternoon, Angela showed them something her shipwright father had taught her about insulation. "If we stuff dry grass between the gaps in the sod bricks, we create air pockets. Air is a terrible conductor of heat. That's why birds fluff their feathers when it's cold, trapping air against their bodies." They couldn't build full double walls, couldn't afford the time or bricks, but they could pack grass into natural gaps between uneven courses, creating insulation layers without adding significant work to an already impossible timeline. Deborah helped gather grass, the 3 women working together in a way that made the impossibility of what they were attempting feel slightly less crushing. For those hours, Laura could almost believe that determination might actually be enough, that will and work could overcome the brutal mathematics of insufficient time and inadequate resources. The confrontation came in the fourth week of September. George White showed up, drunk, weaving slightly. As he dismounted, words slurred but anger sharp underneath. "You teaching my wife to abandon her family!" His voice carried across the prairie, loud enough to scatter birds from nearby grass. Laura stood slowly, putting herself between George and the worksite. "I'm teaching her to cut sod." "She doesn't need to know that. She has a husband." The word came out like an accusation, like having a husband was supposed to solve everything, make all other knowledge irrelevant. Deborah stepped forward, moving carefully around her pregnant belly. "I'm learning skills, George, that's all." "Skills for what?" "Running away, leaving me and the baby. Skills for surviving if I need to." The way she said it left room for interpretation. Could mean surviving if he died. Surviving if he left. Surviving if she decided she couldn't stay married to a man who showed up drunk and angry whenever she did something he didn't control. George's face went red, veins standing out on his neck. But there were witnesses now. Angela, standing with her arms crossed. Stephen Taylor, who'd ridden up to check on the chimney installation. George knew he couldn't drag Deborah away without making himself look like exactly what he was. And that knowledge seemed to choke him worse than any physical restraint. He left without touching her, but the warning was clear in every line of his rigid back. This wasn't over. Jonathan Wright returned in early October when the walls had reached 4 feet, arriving with the quiet confidence of someone who believed he knew how this story ended. He dismounted slowly, walked around the structure with his hands clasped behind his back, testing stability by pushing against walls that didn't move under his weight, checking level with his experienced eye, examining the grass-packed insulation technique with something that might have been grudging respect. "Mrs. Whitfield," he spoke German, still the language they shared. "I came 3 weeks ago with an offer of $20. Laura kept working, stacking another brick, refusing to make this easy for him. "I'm raising it to 30. That's enough for train tickets east for you and the children, enough to start over in Pennsylvania or Ohio, where winter doesn't kill people who make mistakes." "Why more?" Laura's hands were covered in mud from chinking, and she didn't bother wiping them clean before looking at him. Jonathan shifted his weight, looked uncomfortable in a way that made Angela stop working to watch. "Because I plan to buy this claim cheap, prove it up myself, then sell it for profit. Standard business on the frontier." He gestured at the walls rising from the pit. "But watching you work these past weeks, I realized something. If you die out here, the claim goes to Timothy Moore. He holds the debt. But if you sell to me now, I get the land before winter proves or disproves what you're building." The truth settled like cold water. Jonathan wasn't being kind. He was being strategic. If Laura succeeded, the land's value would increase because she'd proven it could support a dwelling. If she failed and died, Timothy Moore would foreclose and Jonathan would lose his chance. Better to buy now while she was desperate before the outcome became clear. "Come back when the house is finished," Laura said, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty she'd felt 3 weeks ago. "Then we'll talk about what this land is worth." Jonathan shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying years of certainty that women didn't understand. Business didn't grasp the realities of frontier economics. "You're a stubborn woman, Mrs. Whitfield." "I'm a desperate woman. There's a difference." The words came out harder than she'd intended, sharp enough that Jonathan actually flinched. What he didn't see as he rode away, Angela and Deborah standing in the wagon doorway, watching. taking his measure, understanding his game, and womanhood decided that whatever legal rights men claimed actual power came from knowing when you were being cheated and refusing to accept it. After Jonathan disappeared into the grass, Angela said what they were all thinking. He wants this land. That's why he keeps raising the offer. He knows something we don't about its value. Let him want it, Laura said, and there was iron in her voice now, tempered by weeks of work that should have broken her but hadn't. It's mine. Scott Moore came at dusk in the 5th week of October, and this time he wasn't alone. He brought 2 men from town, their names and faces irrelevant, their presence serving only to make the threat more explicit. Mrs. Whitfield, my father sent me with a reminder. Scott walked around the half-built house, boots leaving prints in the disturbed earth. The debt is now $58, due by spring, but we both know you won't make it that long. He kicked at the wall, not hard enough to damage, but hard enough to show contempt. Shame if something happened to this before winter. Prairie fires start from nothing out here. Lightning strikes spark from a cook fire lantern tipped over in the wind. Angela stepped out of the wagon with the axe in her hands, holding it not like a tool, but like a weapon, the difference obvious in her stance. You threatening us? Her voice was flat, empty of everything except the promise of violence if pushed. Scott laughed, but it sounded forced. Just making conversation. Then converse somewhere else. Angela took a step forward, and one of Scott's men moved to intercept. Angela raised the axe, and the movement was precise enough to make everyone recalculate. I've got nothing to lose. Husband dead, home foreclosed, no reputation left to protect. You know what that makes me. What? Scott's smile was fading, uncertainty creeping in around the edges. Dangerous. The word hung in the air like smoke. Tell Timothy Moore that if anything happens to this house, this claim, or these people, I'll walk into every church, every store, every saloon in this county, and tell everyone who'll listen that Moore and Sons burns out widows and orphans. Won't need proof, just need people to wonder. Small town like this, rumors spread faster than fire, and they burn longer. Scott's smile died completely. He'd underestimated these women, had thought desperation made them weak, when actually it made them willing to do things that comfortable people couldn't imagine. They left, but the tension stayed behind like residue coating everything. That night, Laura and Angela took turns keeping watch, neither willing to risk that the threat had been empty. They did this for 3 nights until exhaustion made them stupid and dangerous to themselves. On the 4th night, Mark Allen appeared with his rifle, settling into the wagon without asking permission. Kathleen heard about Scott's visit. I'll sleep here tonight, just a precaution. Laura started to protest, started to say they couldn't ask. This couldn't take him away from his own work. You're not asking. Kathleen's telling. There's a difference. Mark settled himself more comfortably, rifle across his lap. Besides, this is good practice for when our boys are old enough to cause trouble. I need to perfect my intimidating father routine. For 3 nights, Mark kept watch. On the 4th night, Jonathan Wright showed up to take a turn, then Donald King, the men forming a rotation without discussion or fanfare. They never said why, never made it into something noble. Just showed up, kept watch, made sure the Moores understood that burning out a widow wouldn't be as easy as they'd assumed. The threat stopped, but the debt remained growing larger with each passing day. Early October, the walls reached 5 feet above the dug floor. Total height from the bottom of the pit, 7 feet, the same height Jonathan had said was necessary. Laura stood back with Angela, both of them coated in dried mud and sweat, and looked at what they'd built through weeks of labor that had aged Laura's body by years. The walls weren't perfectly even. Sod had settled in some places, more than others, creating subtle waves in the surface. But they were standing solid 2 feet thick at every point, with grass packed into every gap for insulation. "The ridge beams next," Laura said, and her voice was hoarse from weeks of breathing dust and exertion. They'd gathered willow poles over the past 3 weeks, cutting them from the creek bottom during breaks when their bodies refused to do more hauling. Each bundle consisted of 3 poles, 6 to 8 feet long, lashed together with rope, using the alternating spiral technique Angela's father had taught her for ship masts. 3 bundles total to span the house length, light enough for 2 women to lift if they didn't have other options, which they didn't. "We need load-bearing supports at each end," Angela said, her shipwright knowledge coming through in the precise way she talked about stress and weight distribution. "The bundles can't rest directly on sod. Too much point pressure. The weight will crush the top course, create cracks that let cold through. We need stone platforms to distribute the load across a wider area." They spent 4 days building the platforms, and it was during this work that Laura fully understood how much Angela knew that she didn't. Not just stacking stones, but understanding how forces traveled through stacked materials, why certain arrangements held and others collapsed under pressure that seemed identical. They gathered stones from the creek bed, walking 3/4 of a mile each way, because the nearby ground was too soft, too recently deposited. Flat stones for bases that wouldn't rock or shift, smaller stones for packing and leveling, clay mud mixed to the right consistency to bind without crumbling, to hold without cracking when it dried. The platforms rose on each end wall, 2 feet wide, 18 inches tall, perfectly level according to the water pan test. Angela explained as they worked, teaching Laura about weight distribution, about how a ship's mast doesn't just sit on the deck, but is supported by a carefully engineered platform that spreads the load across multiple beams. "Same principle here," Angela said, setting another stone with the precision of someone who understood that small mistakes compounded into catastrophic failures. "The ridge beam presses down. If that pressure concentrates on a single point, it punches through. But spread it across 2 feet of platform and the force dissipates, gets absorbed by multiple bricks working together." Laura learned as they worked, absorbing knowledge that would have seemed abstract weeks ago, but now felt concrete as the stones they were stacking. Building wasn't just about piling materials higher. It was about understanding invisible forces and predicting how everything would behave under stress that hadn't arrived yet, but would inevitably when winter came and tested every decision they'd made. The morning of the ridgepole installation arrived with clear skies that felt like a mockery. Laura sent Brandon and Emily to Kathleen's house, refusing to let them watch work, too dangerous for children to witness. This part could kill her, and she didn't want their last memory to be watching their mother die, trying to prove everyone wrong. She and Angela built the A-frame from 2 longer poles they'd cut specifically for this purpose, bracing them against the completed end walls like a tent skeleton. Rope threaded over the peak created a crude pulley system, the kind of mechanical advantage that turned impossible into merely brutal. The first bundled ridge beam was tied to one rope end, the knots checked and rechecked until Angela declared them adequate. Laura and Angela each took hold of the other rope end, their hands already trembling from anticipation of the effort required. On 3, Laura said. They pulled. The beam rose 6 inches, 1 foot 2 feet. The rope cut into Laura's palms, pressing into scars and calluses, with surgical precision, finding every weak point. Blood started seeping through her wrapped hands, but stopping meant the beam falling, meant starting over, meant wasting strength they couldn't replace. At 3 feet, the lashing started to slip. The 3 poles within the bundle began twisting, separating, as the rope allowed rotational force to overcome the binding. Hold! Angela threw her shoulder against the A-frame, bracing it with her body weight, while the whole structure swayed like something alive. Laura tied off her rope end with shaking hands, every movement precise, despite the panic screaming at her to rush. She scrambled to retie the lashing with one hand while holding the A-frame steady with the other, a feat of coordination that shouldn't have been possible, but became possible when the alternative was watching weeks of work collapse. The rope cut deeper into her palm, blood running down her wrist, dripping onto the ground. The poles kept twisting, kept trying to separate. Any second now, they'd come completely apart, and the whole bundle would fall, and probably take the A-frame with it, and maybe kill them both in the process. Got it, Laura finished. The knot tested it with a sharp pull that sent new pain through her damaged hands. They resumed pulling. 3.5 feet, 4 feet, the top of the walls, almost there, almost crack. Not the ridge beam, the A-frame. The left support pole split along a weak spot Laura had missed when cutting it from the creek bottom, the sound like a rifle shot that made both women jump. The A-frame tilted sideways with the grinding inevitability of something massive losing balance. The ridge beam, not yet secured, started sliding off the wall top, dragging the ropes, pulling the whole structure toward catastrophic collapse. Laura didn't think, didn't calculate, just moved. She dropped the rope and scrambled up the packed earth ramp they'd built weeks ago for placing high bricks, her boots finding purchase through muscle memory. She threw herself against the beam, pushing with her shoulder, her hip, every ounce of desperate strength channeled into stopping momentum that physics said couldn't be stopped. The beam was still sliding, still moving toward the edge where it would fall and take all their work with it. Angela was beside her in seconds that felt like hours, pushing from the other side, both women screaming with effort that went beyond language, beyond thought, pure animal determination, refusing to let go of something they'd built with blood and exhaustion. The beam shifted, caught on an uneven spot in the sod, stopped sliding. Together they shoved it the final 6 inches into position, the bundle settling onto the stone platform with a sound like finality, like something clicking into place that was never meant to move again. They collapsed on the wall top, breathing hard enough that their vision went gray at the edges, hearts hammering so hard it felt like their ribs might crack. Laura's hands were bleeding freely now, blood mixing with mud and sweat dripping onto the walls they'd built. 1 down, Angela managed through ragged breathing. 2 to go. They learned from the first attempt. For the second beam, they reinforced the A-frame with additional cross-bracing, using rope to tie support poles together at multiple points, so no single weak spot could cause total failure. They moved slower, checked every knot 3 times, refused to rush, even though every minute spent felt like time stolen from an ever-shrinking deadline. It took 4 hours, but they got the second beam in place. By the time they finished, the sun was past its peak shadows, starting to lengthen toward evening. The third beam went up as light was dying. They worked by feel, More than sight, their hands knowing where ropes and poles needed to go, even when eyes couldn't see clearly. When the final beam settled into position, they climbed down on legs that barely held their weight and stood looking at what they'd done. 3 bundled ridge beams spanning the width of the house. Not a single massive timber like traditional construction, but 3 lighter assemblies that together could hold the weight of a sod roof weighted with snow. Different, unconventional, but functional in ways that traditional methods weren't, when you had no crew, no equipment, nothing except determination and bodies that refused to quit, despite every rational reason to surrender. That evening, as they sat exhausted by the wagon, Donald King rode up, carrying something wrapped in canvas. 62 years old, widowed 4 years ago, living alone on a claim he'd proved up years before. He'd been watching Laura's progress from 4 miles south, seeing something in her effort that resonated with his own losses. "Brought you something." He handed down the bundle heavy enough that Laura almost dropped it. She unwrapped it carefully. Tar paper, 3 rolls, quality material that would keep the roof from leaking, probably worth $5 she didn't have. "I can't. My wife died in '84. Cholera." Donald's voice was quiet, matter-of-fact, in the way of people who'd learned that emotion didn't change facts. "I built our house after she was gone, and I built it wrong. Too fast. Didn't think about the details. She would have noticed the small things that make the difference between a structure that works and one that merely stands." He paused, looking at Laura's walls rising from the pit. "You're building this right? Taking time to do it properly, even though time is the one thing you don't have. That takes courage I didn't have when I needed it." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Laura holding tar paper that felt heavier than it should, weighted with the knowledge that people were helping not because she could pay them, but because helping was what you did when you saw someone fighting against odds that should have crushed them. Laura sat with the tar paper in her lap, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself cry. Not from sadness or despair, but from the overwhelming weight of unexpected kindness. Stephen's chimney collar, Donald's tar paper, Kathleen's food and lard, Mark's night watches, Angela's knowledge given freely. A community forming around her without her noticing, people who saw what she was trying to do and decided to help anyway. Angela put an arm around her shoulders, said nothing because nothing needed saying. Week 6, late October. They started laying rafters across the ridge beams. The bundled willow poles went perpendicular to the ridges, spaced 18 inches apart, to distribute roof weight while minimizing materials. Then came the brush layer, wild plum and willow branches, woven between rafters to create a lattice that would support the final sod layer. Deborah came to help weave brush, despite her pregnancy, advancing, working carefully, because falling from roof height could kill both her and the baby. The 3 women worked in rotation, 1 on the roof, placing materials, 2 on the ground, cutting and preparing switching, when exhaustion made roof work too dangerous. 1 rafter bundle slipped during placement, fell 8 feet, missed Brandon by 2 feet. The sound it made hitting the ground was like something breaking, though nothing actually broke except Laura's sense that this work could be done safely. Brandon went white, and still 7 years of life, insufficient preparation for understanding how close he'd come to dying. Emily started crying, not because she'd been scared, but because Brandon had been scared, and his fear frightened her more than the falling rafter. Laura's voice came out shaking when she spoke. "New rule. Children stay 100 yards away during any roof work. No exceptions, no arguments. Brandon nodded, still white, and took Emily's hand to lead her away to the safe distance their mother had just established. The day after the roof was 70% complete, the sky darkened from the northwest. Laura looked at the clouds approaching and felt her stomach drop. They weren't gray like normal rain clouds. They were black-green, the color of bruises, the color of violence building in atmosphere that had decided to stop being gentle. "We need to secure everything," Laura said, and the urgency in her voice made Angela move without questions. They worked frantically, tied down the canvas on the wagon, moved all their supplies inside the partial house, under the incomplete roof that might or might not provide protection, weighted down loose materials with stones, with sod bricks, with anything heavy enough to resist wind. The rain began as they finished the last tie-down drops, hitting like thrown pebbles, hard enough to hurt. Not hard at first, just steady. Heavy drops that promised worse was coming, that made it clear this was merely the beginning of something larger. Then it became a downpour. Rain so thick, visibility dropped to 20 feet. Rain that turned the prairie into a sea of mud in minutes, that found every weakness in their construction, every gap, every flaw they'd tried to hide or ignore. The rain continued for 3 days without stopping, without even slowing. The prairie became a landscape that belonged underwater grass, flattened by the weight of water, the ground itself turning liquid underfoot. Laura and Angela huddled in the wagon with Brandon and Emily, watching through torn canvas as their work faced its first real test. The temperature had dropped with the rain, maybe 45 degrees outside, cold enough that the children shivered despite blankets. The cut sod turned waterlogged, drinking in moisture, until bricks that had weighed 40 pounds dry now weighed 60, 70. The walls began absorbing water like sponges, the dense root structure that held them together also making them retain every drop that touched them. Laura watched the courses seem to sag, watched them compress under the combined weight of the partial roof and the water saturation, and felt her chest tighten with the certainty that everything was about to collapse. "It's going to fall," Angela whispered, on the second day, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating obvious facts. "We don't know that yet," but Laura's voice shook, betraying the lie. Brandon was shivering despite the blankets, small body losing heat faster than they could replace it. Emily cried from the cold, and the fear in the adults' voices from understanding on some level that something bad was happening, even if she couldn't articulate what. Laura gave the children the last dry blankets, wrapped herself and Angela in damp wool that smelled of mildew, and provided almost no warmth. Angela's cough got worse on the second day, each hack sounding wet and deep rattling in her chest in a way that made Laura think of Robert dying from cholera, made her wonder if Angela was going to die from pneumonia before they even made it to winter. The rain drummed on canvas. Water leaked through the tear Laura had never mended, creating puddles on the wagon bed that they soaked up with rags and wrung out into buckets and watched refill immediately. Laura's hands, already ruined from weeks of construction, turned white and wrinkled from constant moisture, the skin softening in a way that made new damage inevitable when they went back to work. Her back, which had just started to feel slightly better, seized up again from the cold and damp, refusing to let her stand straight when she tried to shift position. They couldn't make a fire. Everything was too wet, and the wagon was too confined, risk of carbon monoxide poisoning too high. They just sat in the cold and damp and waited. Mid-afternoon on day 2 of rain, Laura saw it. The north wall was sagging, not obviously maybe 3 inches, but enough that she could see the curve where there should have been a straight line, could see the way the courses were compressing under load they hadn't been designed to bear. "We have to do something," Laura's voice cut through the sound of rain. "Like what?" Angela's voice was hoarse from coughing, barely audible. "Everything's under water." Laura didn't answer, just pulled on her boots and stepped out into the rain. The cold was shocking. Rain drove sideways, soaking her instantly, finding every gap in her clothing. She couldn't see more than 10 feet through the downpour, the world reduced to gray sheets of water. She walked to the wall, pressed her hands against it. Cool, saturated, heavy with water. Definitely bowing inward under the roof weight, the structural integrity compromised in ways that might be recoverable or might be fatal. 3 options presented themselves with brutal clarity. Let it settle and hope it held. Try to reinforce with more water-logged sod, or dismantle the roof to reduce weight and lose weeks of work. None of them good. All of them variations on disaster. Laura chose option 2 because it was the only choice that didn't require accepting failure. She ran back to the wagon water, streaming from her hair and clothes. "Angela, I need your help." "You're insane. We'll die of exposure. The wall is collapsing. Either we reinforce it now, or we lose everything." Laura's voice carried a certainty. She didn't feel authority borrowed against future failures. Angela looked at Brandon and Emily, 2 children who'd already lost their father, who couldn't afford to lose their home before it was even finished. She understood what Laura wasn't saying. Sometimes you had to risk dying quickly to avoid dying slowly. "Show me what to do." They worked for 7 hours in the downpour, cutting fresh sod strips to wrap around the sagging section like bandages on a wound, hauling 70-pound bricks through ankle-deep mud that sucked at their boots with each step, trying to pull them down into earth that wanted to consume everything. Laura's hands went numb after the first hour. She couldn't feel her fingers anymore, couldn't tell if she was gripping the spade properly. Just kept cutting, kept hauling, kept moving, because stopping meant the wall collapsed and all their work became meaningless. Angela's cough got worse with each hour, each breath, a wheeze that sounded like drowning. But she kept working, kept hauling bricks that were too heavy for her strength, kept moving forward through exhaustion that should have stopped her hours ago. They packed the reinforcing strips around the bowing wall, used their bodies as braces, pushing against the wall while packing sod behind them, their weight the only thing preventing immediate collapse. Dusk on day 2, still raining. The entire north wall shifted inward 3 inches with a grinding sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a noise that spoke of fundamental structural failure. Laura thought it was over, weeks of work collapsing into mud. She threw herself against the wall in a gesture that was pure instinct, trying to stop with her body what physics said couldn't be stopped. "Laura, no." Angela grabbed her, yanked her back with strength that came from somewhere beyond exhausted muscles. "You'll be crushed." They stood in the rain, watching, waiting for complete collapse, waiting for the walls to fold inward and bury the dream of shelter under tons of saturated earth. The wall stopped moving. The dense root structure locked together, compressed, but held grass gripping grass earth, fused to earth through forces Laura didn't understand, but could see working. The structure had compressed, had settled lower than planned, but it was standing. The rain stopped on day 4. When they could finally inspect the damage in weak sunlight that felt like mockery, they found the walls had settled maybe 2 inches lower overall. The north wall had a visible bow to it, a curve that shouldn't exist in proper construction but wasn't severe enough to compromise the structure's ability to function. But the walls were standing. Against every prediction, against the brutal mathematics of weight and water and time, the walls were standing. The cutting ground was a muddy disaster, unusable for 3 more days after the rain stopped. 5 days lost total, 5 days they absolutely couldn't afford. As October died and November approached with its promise of hard freezes, time remaining until first killing cold, maybe 5 weeks, maybe 4 if the weather turned early. The deadline had accelerated while they fought to save what they'd already built. But the walls had held, and that had to be enough. Week after the rains, George White appeared sober, which made him more dangerous. He sat his horse with the rigid posture of someone whose anger had calcified into something harder than rage, something that wouldn't burn out, but would smolder for years. Deborah's coming home. Not a request, a statement delivered like he was reading from a contract that couldn't be disputed. Laura straightened from where she'd been installing the door-salvaged wagon boards hung on leather hinges that would freeze in winter but were all she could afford. That's Deborah's decision. She's my wife, carrying my child. George's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. You're filling her head with ideas above her station. Deborah emerged from the wagon where she'd been resting, 7 months pregnant, now moving slowly. I'm right here, George. Talk to me not about me. You're coming home. This foolishness ends today. I'll come home when I choose to. The way Deborah said it left no room for negotiation, each word hard-edged and final. George's hand moved toward his belt, toward where he might carry a weapon, toward enforcing through violence what he couldn't achieve through authority. Laura stepped between them, putting her ruined body between George and his wife, betting that he wouldn't strike in front of witnesses. You don't want to do that. Laura's voice was quiet, but something in it made George hesitate. Who's going to stop me? You. Me, Angela said from the wagon doorway, axe in her hands again, the weapon becoming her signature. And me. Stephen Taylor called from 30 yards away, riding up with metal tools that could serve other purposes if needed. Mark Allen appeared from the other direction, rifle across his saddle, not pointing at anyone, but present and visible. George looked at the 4 of them, calculated his odds, found them poor. His face went purple with rage that had nowhere to go, no outlet except retreat. This isn't over, Deborah. You're still my wife. No. Deborah's voice was steady, resolved in ways George didn't understand yet. Actually, it is over. You can see your child when she's born, but I'm not coming back to that house. George rode away, and everyone watched him go, understanding that men like him didn't accept defeat, just postponed confrontation until they found better odds. The house was finished on November 10, 1887. Laura stood outside in late afternoon light that came at a slant, now autumn dying into something colder, and looked at what desperation had built. 10 feet by 12 feet, walls 2 feet thick, 5 feet above the sunken floor, 7 feet total from pit bottom. Sod roof with Donald's tar paper underlayer grass insulation packed in every gap between uneven bricks. One south-facing window, the $1.12 window that had cost half her remaining money. Door of wagon boards on leather hinges latched with a wooden bar. Stephen's chimney collar installed perfectly, smoke, drawing clean. Total cash spent $2.60. $1.12 for window glass, $1.48 for nails, rope, and the few items she couldn't scavenge or build. Everything else had come from earth or community, from sod bricks cut by hand and willow poles gathered from the creek and tar paper given freely and knowledge shared without payment. Inside the stove glowed with the first real fire she'd allowed herself to build, heat radiating into space that would either hold it or bleed it away into winter that was coming regardless. The dirt floor was packed hard as stone from weeks of walking the same paths. Walls rose around them, solid and silent, warm to the touch where afternoon sun had heated them through hours of exposure. Brandon claimed a spot near the stove where he could tend the fire and feel useful. Emily wanted to sleep by the window so she could see stars, her 4-year-old logic understanding that walls were meant to protect, but also wanting to maintain contact with the sky that couldn't be contained. Angela stood in the center of the small space, turning slowly, like she was measuring something invisible. "It's smaller than my father's tool shed, smaller than any dwelling I've lived in since leaving Boston." "Will it work?" Laura asked, needing someone else to say it, because she couldn't trust her own judgment anymore, exhausted, past the point where decisions felt reliable. Angela touched the wall, pressed her palm flat against packed sod and grass roots and earth that had been prairie 3 months ago. "Ask me in February." That evening, people came appearing from across the prairie like they'd coordinated without speaking. Kathleen brought stew in a pot still warm from her stove. Jonathan Wright appeared with real coffee, the expensive kind from town. Donald King brought honey in a jar that caught firelight. Stephen Taylor brought tin cups he'd made simple metalwork that transformed drinking from a chore into something approaching ceremony. They sat in the small house, 6 adults and 2 children, crammed into space barely larger than a wagon bed, eating and drinking while wind tested the door and found it secured. While temperature outside dropped toward freezing and temperature inside held at something survivable. Mark Allen raised his tin cup firelight, reflecting off the surface. "To women who don't quit when they should." Angela laughed, the sound surprising in its genuineness. "We knew when to quit. We just decided not to." The words hung in the air like truth finally spoken, like admission that what they'd done was insane and necessary in equal measure. For the first time since Matthew had ridden away with their horse and their savings and 6 months of her life, Laura slept without dreaming of failure. The house might kill them when real cold arrived, might prove insufficient when winter showed its teeth, but tonight the walls held. Tonight they had shelter. Tonight was enough. December brought cold that felt like practice, like winter warning them about what was coming. Temperature dropped to 15 degrees, and the interior held at 52. Laura built a moderate fire and watched the small miracle of walls that stored heat instead of bleeding it immediately into the frozen night. But the real discovery came morning after she let the fire die overnight, expecting to wake to temperatures that would make breathing hurt. Instead, 36 degrees inside. Cold, but not killing cold. Not the kind of cold that froze water in buckets or turned fingers white with frostbite. Angela understood first, her shipwright knowledge translating into thermal dynamics. The walls absorbed heat during the day, from the stove, from sun on the south wall, from our bodies. Now they're releasing it slowly, like ballast stone on a ship. Takes hours to heat up, takes hours to cool down. Laura pressed her palm against the interior wall. Felt coolness that wasn't cold, felt earth holding warmth the way Jonathan Wright had said was impossible. How long will it last? until the walls freeze solid. But if we keep a small fire going during the day, they'll never freeze completely. They'll just keep cycling, storing and releasing, storing and releasing. Fuel became obsession. They gathered everything combustible, twisted prairie grass, buffalo chips dried by sun and wind, dead stalks from the creek bottom, dead wood from the few trees growing in sheltered draws. By month's end, they had 5 weeks of fuel stockpiled against the exterior wall, creating another layer of insulation while simultaneously preparing for cold that would test everything. Mid-December, a woman arrived seeking help that Laura wasn't qualified to provide. Linda Brown was 52 years old, the closest thing Custer County had to medical knowledge, midwife and doctor combined through experience rather than education. She'd delivered half the children in the county, had buried a quarter of the mothers. Kathleen says you have a child with persistent cough. Linda examined Emily with hands that had touched more illness than Laura wanted to imagine, listening to her chest, asking questions about appetite and energy that Laura answered with increasing dread. Not pneumonia, just a stubborn cold that won't quit in this weather. Keep her warm. Give her honey if you have it. Linda turned to Laura, eyes sharp behind exhaustion. But I'm not here just for her. I'm here to check on you. I'm functional. The best Laura could claim, the only truth that mattered. You're functional the way a horse is functional after it's been ridden too hard. Still moving, but not for much longer. Linda pulled out a small bottle liquid, dark inside. Willow bark tea. Boil it every morning for the back pain. Won't fix anything, but it'll make work possible instead of agony. She handed Laura the bottle, then pulled her aside where the others couldn't hear. I delivered Deborah's first baby 3 years ago, stillborn. She almost died, not from blood loss, but from despair. George blamed her, said she'd done something wrong, and she believed him even though he was lying. Why are you telling me this? Because Deborah's due in late January, and I think she's going to need somewhere to go after the birth, somewhere that isn't George's house. Linda's voice dropped lower. He's the kind of man who sees his wife leaving as theft. Who'll try to take the baby if he can't take Deborah back? Laura looked at the small house, barely adequate for 3 people, certainly not designed for 5 plus an infant. She can come here when the time comes. It might not be safe for any of you. She can still come. The words were simple, final, carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade once spoken. Linda nodded like she'd expected this answer, like she'd been testing something and found it solid enough to trust. Jonathan Wright came by in the second week of December, riding through snow that had started falling that morning and hadn't stopped. He sat his horse staring at smoke rising from the chimney, at walls half buried by drifts that had formed overnight. Laura opened the door, letting warmth escape into cold that tried to rush in and claim it. "You're still here." Jonathan spoke German, still the language they shared, becoming something like intimacy through repetition. "Still here." Laura didn't invite him inside, and he didn't ask. He studied the house, the walls, the snow accumulating on the roof. This cold is practice. Wait until January. Wait until a real blizzard comes, the kind that drops 60 degrees in 6 hours and kills people who thought they were prepared. But something in his voice had changed. He didn't sound certain anymore, didn't carry the absolute conviction that had characterized his earlier warnings. "The walls will hold." Laura said it not because she knew it was true, but because saying it made it feel more possible. Sod isn't wood. Sod isn't stone. The words were familiar, repeated from earlier warnings, but they sounded hollow now, like Jonathan was arguing against mounting evidence rather than stating obvious facts. These walls are 2 feet of earth that remembers summer. They'll hold through whatever winter brings. Jonathan rode away, and Angela watched from the doorway. He's scared you might succeed, because if you do everything he told you was wrong. And men like that would rather die than admit they were wrong about something fundamental. Week later, Brandon asked to check the rabbit snares he'd set near the low-rise 50 yards from the house. Temperature was mild, 18 degrees sun, making everything sparkle like the prairie had been coated in crushed glass. "Stay where I can see you." Laura's rule, established after the twisted ankle incident weeks ago, established because the prairie could swallow children in seconds. Brandon promised, ran out into the mild morning young enough that 2 days of weather above zero felt like spring arriving early. 30 minutes later, Laura looked up from her work and couldn't see him. Panic arrived immediately, ice in her chest that had nothing to do with temperature. She and Angela searched, moving in expanding circles, calling his name into silence that swallowed sound. They found him in a shallow draw ankle, twisted again, sitting in snow, because he couldn't climb the steep embankment on his own. Only 60 yards from the house, but invisible in the depression, lost in landscape that looked flat until you fell into its hidden geography. Laura slid down, grabbed him, carried him back with strength that came from somewhere beyond exhausted muscles. His ankle swelled, immediately turning purple in ways that meant serious damage. That night, new rules spoken into the small house. No one goes out of sight, even on clear days, even for good reasons. The prairie doesn't care about your reasons. It just takes people who make mistakes. Brandon nodded, understanding, in his 7-year-old way, that his mistake had almost cost him everything, that his mother's fear was proportional to how close he'd come to dying from something as simple as a twisted ankle and a steep slope. Laura lay awake that night, thinking about what would have happened if this had occurred during a storm, if she'd had to search in conditions where visibility dropped to zero, where cold killed in minutes. Thinking about the margins between survival and death, growing thinner as winter approached, as weather stopped being forgiving. January 9th, 1888. Deborah appeared riding slowly, one hand supporting her back contractions already starting. "George left for town 3 days ago. Said he'd be back in a week. Baby doesn't care about his schedule." Deborah's voice was tight with pain and something that might have been relief, that timing had given her this gift, this opportunity to give birth away from George's presence. Laura sent Brandon running to fetch Linda Brown, while Angela helped Deborah inside, got her settled on the bed they'd improvised from blankets and buffalo robes. For 18 hours, Deborah labored in the small house while January wind tested the walls and found them solid. Linda coached with the patience of someone who'd seen birth go right and wrong in equal measure, who knew that most of what happened was beyond anyone's control, that sometimes babies came easy, and sometimes they didn't, and you couldn't predict which until it was happening. Angela kept water boiling, kept the stove fed, kept Brandon and Emily occupied in the far corner with quiet games that didn't intrude on the sounds of labor that filled every other space. Laura watched and learned, understanding for the first time what women's bodies were capable of enduring, what pain looked like when it served a purpose instead of just being pain for its own sake. At dawn on January 10th, Deborah's daughter entered the world screaming with outrage at being thrust into Nebraska. Winter 7 pounds of fury, wrapped in skin, too new to have developed tolerance for cold or hunger or any of the thousand discomforts that would define her existence. Deborah held her and cried, tears running into the baby's dark hair. "She's alive! She's alive!" Linda wrapped the baby, checked her over with practiced efficiency. "Of course she's alive. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs, that work? You did good." But Laura understood what Deborah meant, understood that her first baby had been stillborn, that this living, screaming child was proof that the first death hadn't been her fault, that her body wasn't broken in the ways George had told her it was. "I'm naming her Hope." Deborah looked at the tiny face, already searching for her mother with blind instinct. "Hope Whitfield White. She can choose which name to use when she's older, choose which family to claim." 3 days later, George arrived, found his wife nursing their daughter in Laura's house, refusing to leave. "You're coming home. That's my daughter. This is my daughter." Deborah's voice carried steel that hadn't been there in September. "You can visit her here, but I'm not going back to that house." George's face went purple, veins standing out on his neck. "I'll drag you home if I have to." Mark Allen stepped into the doorway, and behind him stood Stephen Taylor, Donald King, Jonathan Wright. 4 men who'd decided that whatever George's legal rights, Deborah had the right to stay where she felt safe. George looked at them, calculated odds, found himself outnumbered by men who wouldn't back down. "This isn't over." "Actually, it is." Deborah adjusted Hope at her breast, the gesture somehow defiant. "You can be part of her life, or you can walk away. But I'm not coming back, and you can't make me." He left, and everyone watched him go, understanding that some endings weren't neat, weren't final, just created new equilibriums where threats became implicit instead of explicit. The morning of January 11th, Laura woke to warmth that felt wrong. She stepped outside, felt air that was above freezing, maybe 32 degrees, maybe higher. Mild breeze from the south carrying smells of earth instead of ice. Brandon asked if he could go outside without his coat, and Laura almost said no from pure reflex. Then she felt the warm air, saw the sunshine, making snow sparkle as it melted. Yes, but stay close. The warning automatic, the fear permanent. Across the prairie, other families made the same decision. Children walked to school in light clothing. Teachers propped open schoolhouse doors. Farmers drove to town without gloves, marveling at weather that felt like April, arriving 3 months early. After 2 weeks of temperatures below zero, after cold that made breathing hurt and water freeze in buckets, the warm spell felt like a gift from a universe that had been trying to kill them, but decided to show mercy. Laura spent the day gathering more fuel, despite Angela's protests that they had enough. Some instinct she couldn't name drove her to work with urgency, to add 3 more days' worth to stockpiles that already seemed adequate. "We have 5 weeks of fuel. Why are we gathering more?" Angela's question was reasonable, logical. "I don't know, but we need more." Laura couldn't explain. It couldn't justify the urgency, except to say that something felt wrong, that temperature swings this extreme often preceded catastrophe. By evening, she'd gathered Deborah, Hope, Angela, Brandon, and Emily into the house, 6 people in space designed for 3. "Everyone sleeps here tonight." "Why?" Deborah asked, nursing Hope by the stove. Laura looked northwest at the horizon, where darkness was building at sky that looked like it was holding its breath. "Because something's coming, and I want everyone together when it arrives." The morning of January 12th began with sunshine that mocked every instinct, screaming warnings in Laura's chest. Same mild warmth as yesterday. Interior temperature 44 degrees with fire, banked low, comfortable enough that they didn't need coats indoors. Laura built up the fire and made breakfast for 6 humans and 1 infant. The house crowded in ways that should have felt claustrophobic, but instead felt like safety in numbers. Brandon was restless from days of confinement, from being 7 years old and trapped indoors while sunshine outside promised freedom. "Can I check the snares, please? I'll stay where you can see me." Laura hesitated, remembering twisted ankles and steep draws and all the ways the prairie found to hurt children who made small mistakes. But it was sunny, warm, clear. Visibility extended for miles. "Don't go past that rise, 30 yards maximum. If I call you, come immediately." The conditions felt important, like establishing rules could somehow control outcomes that were fundamentally beyond control. Brandon promised meant it ran out into mild morning that felt nothing like January in Nebraska. By mid-morning, darkness had grown on the northwestern horizon. Not clouds in any traditional sense, more like a wall, a gray-white barrier stretching across the sky, moving toward them with speed visible to naked eyes. Laura stepped outside. Wind had shifted from gentle south to aggressive northwest. Temperature was dropping, the change so rapid she could feel it happen, could feel warmth being stolen from air in real time. "Brandon inside now?" Her voice carried panic she couldn't suppress. He was 40 yards away, near the low rise, visible and safe. He looked up at her. Call started running back toward the house with the obedience of a child who'd learned that his mother's fear meant real danger. The wall hit before he covered half the distance. One moment, Brandon clearly visible, small figure running across brown and prairie. Next moment, gone, swallowed by snow so thick and sudden that the world simply ceased to exist. Wind struck like a physical attack, nearly knocked Laura off her feet. Temperature dropped so fast she gasped, cold, searing her lungs with each breath. Snow was everywhere, instantly in her eyes, her mouth, her nose, making vision impossible and breathing difficult. "Brandon!" She screamed it into wind that stole the sound before it traveled 10 feet. She ran toward where he'd been, but the snow was total absolute, a white wall that had replaced reality. She couldn't see the house behind her, couldn't see her hand in front of her face. Wind screamed so loud she couldn't hear her own voice, couldn't hear anything except the roar of atmosphere, trying to kill everything in its path. Stop. Think. Force herself to think, despite panic, trying to shut down rational thought. Wind from northwest. Brandon was southeast of house.